I never expected to wake up to three bulldozers blocking my driveway, or that Nancy Williams, the HOA president, would be smirking behind them. But there she was. What she didn't know, she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life, because I literally owned the ground beneath her feet, and she had no idea who she was messing with. It all started 2 weeks earlier. The morning sun warmed my back as I knelt in the soft dirt, planting the last of my tomato seedlings. After 15 years working 80-hour weeks at my law firm, I had finally found peace in growing things. The feel of soil between my fingers, the quiet promise of fresh vegetables. This was what kept me sane. But peace never lasts long when Nancy Williams is your HOA president. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" I looked up. Nancy stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed tightly over her designer blouse. Her perfectly highlighted hair didn't move in the breeze. Her thin lips pressed together in disapproval. "Good morning, Nancy," I said, wiping my hands on my apron, "just expanding my vegetable garden a bit." Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed my raised garden beds. "This is completely unacceptable," she snapped. "Front yards in Willow Creek Estates must be properly landscaped with approved plants only. Vegetable gardens belong in backyards, hidden from view." I took a deep breath. Nancy had ruled over the HOA for 5 years, and in that time, our once friendly neighborhood had become a battleground of petty rules and surprise fines. "Nancy, my property deed predates the HOA by 30 years. I have grandfather exemptions on most of these rules." Her nose wrinkled as she glanced at my dirt-stained jeans. "That's not how it works," she snapped, pulling out her phone. "I'm documenting this violation. The board will be notified immediately." She took multiple photos, her fingers flying across the screen. Two neighbors walking their dogs slowed down to watch. "I've read every page of the HOA agreement," I said calmly, standing up, "and I have written acknowledgement from the previous board confirming my exemption. Would you like to see the paperwork?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Save it for the hearing. You'll be receiving a formal violation notice by tomorrow." She gestured vaguely at my garden beds. "I suggest you remove all this before fines begin accumulating." As she marched away, I saw Mr. Jenkins from across the street, watching with sympathy. Just last month, Nancy had fined him $500 because his mailbox was the wrong shade of green. That evening, true to her word, I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. $53 daily fine until the unapproved agricultural activity was removed. The hearing was scheduled for next week. I took the notice inside and added it to my growing file labeled HOA Nonsense. But this time, something felt different. Something felt personal. I didn't know it yet, but Nancy wasn't just coming after my garden. She was covering up something much, much bigger. And by the time I was done, she wished she had just left me alone. I didn't expect to spend my morning digging through old legal documents. But something about the way Nancy had threatened me felt off. She'd always been petty, a power-hungry HOA president who delighted in harassing homeowners over nonsense. But this time, she was rushing. Why? I sat in my attic, surrounded by dusty boxes, searching for an answer. That's when I found it. An old manila folder, yellowed with age. Inside, there were land sale agreements from 1978, back when my grandfather sold parts of our land to Willow Creek developers. I scanned the documents, my pulse quickening. The Anderson family retained the mineral rights to all 200 acres of land beneath the development. We also owned all utility easements, the very ground where the neighborhood's gas lines and water pipes were buried. And most importantly, our property was legally exempt from any future HOA governance. I sat back, heart pounding. This meant Nancy had no authority over me, at all. And that also meant she already knew this, because if there was one thing Nancy hated, it was not being in control. I was still processing everything when I heard it. The rumbling of heavy engines outside. I rushed to my front window and my stomach dropped. 3 massive bulldozers, parked across my driveway, blocking my car. And standing in front of them, like a queen overseeing her kingdom, was Nancy Williams. She was flanked by a tall man in a suit, someone I didn't recognize. A crowd of neighbors had already gathered on the sidewalk, watching. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and my folder of HOA documents. Whatever game Nancy was playing, she had just made a serious mistake, and she was about to find out why. I stepped onto my front porch. Nancy's face lit up with triumph, her smile cold and sharp. The bulldozer operators sat idling their engines, waiting for instructions. "James Anderson," Nancy called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "The board held an emergency meeting last night. Your violations are so severe that immediate action has been authorized." The man beside her stepped forward, adjusting his expensive suit. "I'm Robert Taylor, legal counsel for Willow Creek Estates, HOA. He gestured toward my garden beds. "These," he said, "are unauthorized structures. Under Section 8.3 of the bylaws, we are proceeding with immediate removal due to public nuisance." The crowd murmured in shock. Mrs. Patel, who had always kept to herself, covered her mouth in horror. The Henderson kids stopped their bikes to stare. I walked calmly down my front steps, my mind racing through options. I needed to stall, to figure out my next move. "Mr. Taylor," I said, keeping my voice steady, "you might want to check your legal footing here." I gestured toward my garden beds. "Those aren't structures. They're temporary garden beds. And more importantly," I locked eyes with him, "you're about to make a very, very expensive mistake." Robert's smug smile faltered slightly. "Your threats don't concern us, Mr. Anderson," he said, straightening his tie. "We have the full authority of the HOA covenant." Nancy stepped forward, practically glowing. "James, this stubbornness is so unnecessary," she cooed. "Just agree to remove the eyesores, pay the accumulated fines, which are now at $300, and we can all move on." The bulldozer engines revved louder. The lead operator looked uncomfortable, glancing between me and Nancy. I pulled out my phone. "Before you proceed," I said, casually tapping my screen, "I should probably let you know I'm recording this." Nancy's smirk twitched. "And," I continued, "I just texted my associate at the law firm. He'll be here any minute." Nancy rolled her eyes dramatically. "Save the legal mumbo-jumbo, James. Nothing you say will stop this." And just then, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The neighbors parted as Sheriff Martinez stepped out. Beside him was a woman carrying a large binder. Nancy's expression changed instantly, from confident to concerned. "What's going on?" she snapped. "We don't need law enforcement for a simple HOA matter." I smiled for the first time that morning. "Nancy," I said, tucking my hands into my pockets, "I don't think you understand exactly whose driveway you blocked." Her brows knitted together. "And you definitely don't know whose land your bulldozers are parked on right now." The county clerk, Miss Abernathy, struggled with the weight of the documents as she spread them across the hood of the sheriff's car. The neighbors inched closer, murmuring. The bulldozer operators cut their engines, sensing the shift in power. Miss Abernathy adjusted her glasses. "These," she said, tapping the old survey maps, "are the original survey maps from 1973. She turned a sharp gaze to Nancy. "And this," she continued, pointing to a specific section, "is the property sale agreement between the Anderson family and Willow Creek developers." Nancy pushed forward, her confidence visibly shaking. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Whatever ancient paperwork you dug up can't override our HOA authority." Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you listen carefully to what Miss Abernathy is about to explain." The county clerk adjusted her glasses. "According to these records," she said, "when the Anderson family sold this land, they retained 3 critical rights. All mineral rights beneath the entire 200-acre development. All utility easements running under the main roads. Explicit exemptions from any future HOAs for the 5 properties they kept." I stepped forward. "And my house," I said, tapping the document, "is one of those 5 properties." Robert Taylor's face drained of color. He frantically flipped through his briefcase. "That's impossible," he muttered. "The HOA covenant applies to all properties within the development." Miss Abernathy smiled patiently. "Your HOA was formed in 1995, Mr. Taylor." She tapped the older document. "These agreements were registered in 1973. Your covenant cannot override pre-existing legal arrangements." Nancy's face turned an alarming shade of red. "This is some kind of trick," she screeched. But the neighbors had heard enough, and for the first time in years, they weren't afraid of her anymore. What she didn't know This was just the beginning. Nancy's face contorted with rage, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. Her power-hungry grip on this neighborhood had lasted too long for her to let go so easily. She turned to the bulldozer operators, her voice sharp. "This changes nothing. Proceed with removal as planned." The lead operator shook his head. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, turning off his engine. "I'm not risking my license on disputed property. Not without a court order." Nancy spun on her heel, jabbing a manicured finger at me. "You think you've won just because of some old land documents?" she hissed. "I'll get that court order. And when I do, this whole ridiculous garden is getting bulldozed." I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice just enough for her to hear the warning in it. "Nancy," I said, "you're about to have much bigger problems than my garden." For the first time, I saw something new in her eyes. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. She had come here expecting a fight, but not one she could lose, and she was just starting to realize how badly she had miscalculated. The HOA's dirty secrets. That evening, I knocked on Eleanor Ramos's door. The elderly widow had lived in our neighborhood since before it even had a name. She had called me earlier that day, cryptic and urgent. "Bring your property documents," and she had said, "and a calculator." Now she sat in her cozy living room, sipping tea as she spread out a stack of HOA financial records on the table. The documents were highlighted, annotated, and filled with yellow sticky notes. I flipped through the pages, my stomach tightening with every new discovery. The HOA had been charging every homeowner an extra $300 a month for a community pool renovation that had never happened. In total, over $300,000 had vanished. I turned to the last page, the bank transfer records. The money had been funneled into a company called WCE Holdings, LLC. The owners, Nancy Williams and Robert Taylor. My blood ran cold. "They've been stealing from us," I whispered. Eleanor nodded. "For years," she said softly. "And they're getting bolder." She handed me another document, a list of 5 elderly homeowners that the HOA had been targeting. Nancy and Robert had been using excessive fines and legal threats to force them to sell their homes at below-market prices. Once the homes were vacated, they planned to buy them through WCE Holdings, renovate them just enough, and flip them for a fortune. It wasn't just corruption, it was organized fraud. I clenched my jaw. "We need to tell everyone," I said, already reaching for my phone. But Eleanor grabbed my wrist. "Not yet," she said. "First, we catch them in the act." The neighborhood uprising. The next night, we held an emergency neighborhood meeting. The clubhouse was packed. People filled every seat, leaned against walls, even stood outside the windows, straining to hear. I hooked my laptop up to the projector, displaying the evidence on the big screen. Page by page, I revealed everything. The missing $300,000, the bogus fines, the fake violations used to push people out of their homes, the fraudulent shell company that Nancy and Robert had set up. Gas filled the room. Angry whispers spread through the crowd. Then Mr. Jenkins, our retired judge who had lived here for over 20 years, stood up. "I move that we vote immediately to remove the entire HOA board and elect temporary leaders until we can hold proper elections." The vote was unanimous. 76 hands shot into the air, one after another. Nancy and Robert were officially out. But where were they? They had been invited to the meeting. They had refused to show up. And that's when my phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. "Check your security cameras." Now my stomach twisted as I opened my camera feed. The entire room fell silent as I held up my phone. Nancy and Robert were at my house. They were ripping up my garden, throwing plants across my lawn. And then Nancy turned directly toward the camera and smiled. She raised a hand and made a slow, deliberate slashing motion across her throat. Then she and Robert got into their car and sped away. The room erupted. "This is criminal," someone shouted. "We need to press charges." I turned to Sheriff Martinez, who had been watching the screen with a grim expression. "Can you arrest them for this?" I asked. "Trespassing, vandalism, and with that gesture, possibly more," he said, already dialing his radio. "But James, be careful." He met my eyes. "People who feel cornered can be dangerous." I nodded, gripping my phone tightly. I wasn't scared of Nancy, but I was done playing defense. It was time to end this. The final threat. Later that night, my phone buzzed again. Another text message, this time with a photo attachment. I opened it and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a picture of my property documents, the ones proving my exemptions from the HOA. Someone had scrawled a message across them in red marker. Originals burn so easily. A cold chill ran down my spine. I knew exactly what this meant. Nancy wasn't just desperate. She was willing to destroy evidence. I had been one step ahead of her so far. But now she was getting reckless. And that meant she was about to make a mistake that would send her straight to prison. I stared at the photo, jaw clenched. Then I dialed Eleanor's number. "James?" She answered immediately. "Eleanor," I said, voice firm. "Call the media. Call the lawyers. Call everyone. It's time to finish this." Nancy thought she could scare me. She thought her bulldozers, her illegal fines, and her petty threats would force me to back down. She had no idea who she was dealing with, because if there's one thing you don't do, it's threaten a lawyer with evidence. The morning after Nancy's late-night vandalism, my house was swarming with news vans. The local media had caught wind of the scandal. Reporters stood on my lawn, cameras rolling, asking me about the HOA fraud scheme, the stolen $300,000, the retaliation against homeowners, and most importantly, how Nancy and Robert had been caught on camera destroying my garden. Nancy had been so smug when she slashed her hand across her throat in front of my security cameras, but she hadn't thought about the consequences. Now that footage was playing on the local news, on repeat, and the entire town was watching. The final HOA meeting. That evening, I walked into what would be Nancy's last HOA meeting. The room was packed. More neighbors had shown up than ever before. Some were angry, some were nervous, but all of them knew something big was about to happen. Nancy and Robert were already there, sitting at the front table, pretending everything was business as usual. Nancy still had that fake, confident smile, but I could see the panic in her eyes. Robert was flipping through paperwork, trying to act distracted. They both knew what was coming. I took my time walking to the front of the room, set down a stack of documents on the table, and hooked up my laptop to the projector. The room fell silent. I clicked play. The screen lit up with the security footage from last night. Nancy, Robert, ripping up my garden, destroying my property. And finally, Nancy turning to the camera and threatening me. The room exploded. Gasps, shouts, neighbors turning to one another in shock. Nancy shot out of her seat. "This is a setup," she screeched. "That video is fake, AI or whatever. You can't prove." "Actually," I interrupted, flipping to the next slide, "we can." A second video played, this time from a neighbor's doorbell camera. A different angle, showing Nancy and Robert laughing as they tossed my plants onto the street. Nancy went pale. Robert's hand clenched into a fist. Then came the real bombshell. I flipped to the next document on screen. The bank records, the ones Eleanor and I found. I pointed to the transactions. This is where the missing $300,000 from the community pool fund went. I zoomed in to a company called WCE Holdings LLC. Then I pulled up the ownership records. And guess who owns WCE Holdings? I turned toward Nancy. "You and Robert." The crowd erupted again, but this time it wasn't shock. It was anger. Nancy opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the double doors to the clubhouse swung open, and in walked Sheriff Martinez. 2 officers followed behind him. Nancy's face drained of color. Robert tried to stand, but the sheriff held up a hand. "Mr. Taylor, Mrs. Williams," he said calmly, "you're both under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and destruction of private property." A ripple of gas moved through the room. Nancy shook her head wildly, stepping back. "You can't. This is insane. I have connections." But the handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Robert tried to run for the back exit, but 2 officers grabbed him before he got 5 steps. The crowd cheered as they were led out of the building. Nancy was screaming. Robert was silent, his face ashen. I followed them outside where a news crew was already waiting. Cameras flashed. Nancy twisted toward me, her eyes full of hatred. "You think you won?" she hissed. "You think this is over?" I just smiled. "No, Nancy," I said. "This is just the beginning." The car door slammed shut, and for the first time in 5 years, Willow Creek Estates was finally free. A new beginning. 2 months later, things had completely changed. The HOA gone. Instead, the neighborhood voted to create the Willow Creek Community Association, a friendly, non-mandatory group that actually helped people instead of bullying them. The stolen money? Recovered. Every homeowner got a refund for every bogus fine Nancy and Robert had ever issued. And the community pool, the one that never got renovated, we finally fixed it. Properly. And as for Nancy's house, she had to sell it to pay her legal fees. The new family who moved in, they helped me plant tomatoes in my front yard on their first weekend here. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my garden in peace. No fines, no threats, no HOA bullies. Just me, my neighbors, and a community we built together. Eleanor handed me a ripe red tomato, smiling. "You changed everything, James." I shook my head. "No, Eleanor," I said, tossing the tomato in the air. "We all did." 2 months after Nancy and Robert's downfall, life in Willow Creek Estates had completely transformed. Gone were the arbitrary fines, the petty threats, and the constant fear of the HOA's next move. Instead, we had something better, a real community. For the first time in years, neighbors actually talked to each other, not just whispered behind closed doors about the latest HOA drama. Block parties replaced violation hearings, garden beds replaced pointless regulations, and instead of HOA board members lurking with clipboards, we had kids playing in the street, homeowners helping each other, and a sense of belonging that had been missing for too long. Nancy's former house, which she had been forced to sell to cover legal fees, now belonged to a young couple with 2 kids. The first thing they did after moving in? Help me plant tomatoes in my front yard. The irony was delicious. The trial. Nancy's last stand. Despite her tantrums, her denials, and her attempts to pull every string she had left, Nancy and Robert had no way out. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Fraud, embezzlement, destruction of property, harassment. And in the case of the elderly residents, they had tried to push out of their homes, even attempted real estate fraud. Nancy tried everything. She blamed the HOA board. She claimed ignorance. She said she was only following orders, despite being the one giving those orders. Robert, on the other hand, quickly turned on her in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony sealed her fate. When the judge read the verdict, I watched Nancy's face. For the first time since I had known her, she didn't look smug. She didn't look powerful. She looked small, like someone who had lost everything because she had. Nancy was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud and property destruction. Robert got 3 years for his role in the embezzlement scheme. And the stolen $300,000? The county seized it from their accounts and returned it to the homeowners they had stolen from. Every single one of us got a check in the mail, including me, a check that I used to expand my garden even more. A lesson in community. One day, as I was watering my tomato plants, Eleanor sat on my porch sipping iced tea. She watched as neighbors walked by, waved, and actually stopped to chat. "You know, James," she said, "you didn't just save your garden, you saved all of us." I shook my head. "No, Eleanor," I said, "we saved each other." Because at the end of the day, it wasn't just about me versus Nancy. It wasn't about one garden or one corrupt HOA. It was about standing up to people who abuse their power. It was about fighting back when people try to intimidate and control you. It was about reminding people that a neighborhood isn't about rules and regulations. It's about people, neighbors, friends, a community that actually cares for one another. Nancy had tried to build an empire on greed and fear, but all it took was one garden, one stand, one truth, to bring it all crumbling down. Epilogue: The Best Revenge. 6 months later, Willow Creek Estates was flourishing. The new Willow Creek Community Association was volunteer-based, donation-driven, and focused on helping instead of harassing. The community pool finally got its long-overdue renovation. The elderly homeowners Nancy had tried to push out, they stayed, and were now respected members of the community, offering gardening tips and helping organize events. And me, I finally got to enjoy my garden in peace. No fines, no threats, no bulldozers, just fresh tomatoes, good neighbors, and the knowledge that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. As I plucked a ripe red tomato from the vine, Eleanor chuckled beside me. "You know, James," she said, "I think these tomatoes taste sweeter now." I grinned. "That's because they're grown in the ashes of Nancy's empire." We laughed, the sun setting behind us, as the neighborhood I had fought for continued to thrive.